Hello, good morning. Today our guest is Professor Matthew Rossano. Hello, Matt. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm great. You sound very effervescent.
Well, I don't know. I'm just a happy guy, I guess.
Yeah, you sound really happy, and I've seen your photo. They're always smiling. We-
There's a lot to be happy about, don't you
yes,
think?
I agree. So we're going to have a really fascinating discussion. The topic will be religion, and the first point will be in relation to rituals. Matt, what is a ritual?
Oh man, books have been written
Yeah.
trying to explain what a ritual is. Let me give you two parts to a ritual, okay? First, one part of a ritual has to do with the gestures that we engage in. Usually, gestures that are associated with a ritual are different from gestures that are associated with ordinary behavior. So normally in ordinary behavior, I use my gestures to try to accomplish something. So I go to the sink, and my glass is dirty. And so I do a bunch of washing gestures so that I get my glass clean so that I can drink a beer out of my glass. All right, those are ordinary goal-oriented gestures. But in ritual, very often we're doing gestures that aren't obviously goal-oriented. And a lot of times these gestures are exaggerated in some way, they're stereotyped, there's a specific script or routine that we're supposed to go through. So, the easiest thing to think about is, say, a church service, where people are putting their hands together, they're bowing, they're kneeling, they're speaking together in unison. They're doing various things that if you were an outsider looking at it, you would be wondering, why are they doing those things? They're not washing anything. They're not getting a memo written. They don't seem to be accomplishing anything utilitarian, any specific obvious goal. And yet these gestures are very scripted. They're very obviously intentional gestures. They're often repetitious gestures. So there are gestures then that we refer to as ritualized gestures that are associated with a ritual. And a lot of times then those gestures are embedded within all kinds of ceremonial, symbolic, cultural activities and symbols that give those gestures some deeper meaning. And so when you put all this together, you have some kind of a ritual, and usually that ritual has a tradition in the culture, and that tradition in the culture tells individuals who they are, where they came from, what their purpose in life is supposed to be. And all of that then gets somehow mixed into the ritual and gives the ritual a place in people's lives and then also in the life of the culture and the community.
All right then. So I prefer to say professor. So prof, are extremely important to transmit social norms? In other words, had it not been for a ritual, would it be more inefficient to transmit such norms?
I think that we use ritualized behaviors very often to transmit norms, to indicate to people how we are supposed to behave in this particular context. So think of in an East Asian culture, bowing is a ritualized gesture. And what does bowing indicate? Bowing usually indicates some kind of respect. And if you go to, say, Japan, Taiwan, any of these cultures, they'll use this ritualized gestures to indicate who they respect. Also, the depth of the bow often indicates how much they respect an individual. And so if you think of any child watching this, they're seeing a gesture which is indicating to them who they're supposed to respect in their community, and how much respect they're supposed to give them. So very often in East Asian communities, the bow to an elder or the bow to someone who is an authority figure is much deeper than the bow just to a coworker or someone you consider your peer. And so that's just one example of how a ritualized gesture communicates some kind of a norm that is accepted in the society. And by growing up in this culture and seeing this gesture repeated over and over again, you inculcate that norm into kids and it gets carried on. That's just one example. There's all kinds of other examples of where some kind of ritualized gesture then is used to express and transmit the norms of a culture, how we're supposed to behave, who we're supposed to respect, how we're supposed to treat others, all those sorts of things. And then if you put those ritualized gestures into a much larger ritual of some sort, like a wedding ritual, say, that also then teaches people what we hold as being valuable. So we're going to hold this wedding ceremony. There's going to be all kinds of ritualized gestures as a part of it. That's transmitting some kind of a message. But then all of the cultural traditions and symbols that surround the wedding ceremony also transmit to people that this is something we value. We value marriage. We value fidelity. We value family. All of those things symbolically get represented and celebrated. And again, any child who's watching this and seeing the adults behave the way they do at this ceremony, they start to get the message, gee, these are some of the important things in life. Getting married is important. Being faithful to your partner is important. Having children and being, forming a family unit, these things are important. This is what the society values. So both the ritualized gestures and then the larger ceremony, the larger ritual that it's incorporated within, all of these things are transmitting values and norms and appropriate ways of thinking and behaving within the culture.
So, do we know why the first rituals emerge?
Well, first of all, ritualized behaviors have a deep evolutionary history. You can see ritualized behaviors in just about any species out there in the world. So think of the mating dance of geese, or think of monkeys and apes when they groom each other. Or maybe the most well-known ritualized gesture to most of us is the play bow of your pet dog. So if you play with your pet dog, at some point, usually in the play session, the dog is going to put his paws and his head to the ground. His butt's going to go way up into the air, and he's going to have this, excited look on his face. It's a bowing sort of gesture, but it's a gesture to indicate that, hey, all of the stuff that I'm going to do here, all the chasing and the biting and the barking, it's all for fun. So those ritualized gestures didn't start with humans by any means. They go way back in the history of life on Earth as ways of indicating intention. So the play bowing dog intends to play, not to fight. Now, when you start to move that forward and you say, okay, when did ritualized gestures start to get somehow surrounded with all of the ceremony and cultural traditions and symbols? That's a different question. So a way to think about this is to think about, okay, geese have a mating ritual or a mating dance that they do. It's a ritualized gesture. What don't geese have? They don't have wedding ceremonies, okay? And so the wedding ceremony is the ritual that surrounds all of these ritualized behaviors. When did that start to happen? That's a real good question. And I think most of us would probably say probably somewhere in maybe like 100,000 years ago or so, when we start to see some of the first evidence of symbolic artifacts being left by our ancestors, when we start to see some evidence of early activities in caves. Some of the first cave etchings might go all the way back to, say, 50,000 years or 70,000 years or so, probably somewhere in that time, when we think our ancestors started to develop the full capacity for language, not just some kind of simple proto-language, but a much fuller form of language as we know it today, when we're all starting to see some of the first evidence of symbolic artifacts, some of the first evidence of art. We think probably around that time, as the human mind is starting to become much more modern and starting to think abstractly, that's probably when the first real rituals started to emerge, where we started to take ritualized behaviors and we started to surround them with cultural traditions and symbols, and they carried some kind of an important message about how this group viewed the universe and their role in it. And I would guess some of these first rituals probably had something to do with very early forms of shamanism, where they were somehow going into some kind of a trance state. And in that state, they perceived that they were interacting with supernatural agents.
All right, that was a mouthful. But do, do you mind if I call you Ross?
Call me whatever you like. As
Yeah,
long as
yeah, I have a slight lisp and a stutter, and your name has some T's in it, so I would prefer to call you Ross.
Sure.
Yes. So, Ross, some conventions never seem to die. Ladies before gentlemen, why do we still express this practice?
Oh, I think that probably goes back into early divisions of labor, probably between males and females, going back into our hunter-gatherer past. And in our hunter-gatherer past, you were much more valuable, really, as a female than you were as a male. Why is that the case? Well, because females reproduced, and males, they were necessary, obviously, for the sex act to get reproduction done. But only, over the course of our evolutionary history did they start to become more and more important in terms of nurturing the offspring, protecting the offspring, somehow supplying and resourcing the female and her offspring. That's probably not something that happened early on in our evolutionary history. Probably came much later in our evolutionary history as offspring became much more dependent. So yeah, ladies first, because ladies need to be protected because they're the ones that reproduce. And if they can't be protected and their offspring can't be protected, then the species really
Will
doesn't have
die.
a chance of survival.
But Ross, we live in a society where people like to mock the patriarchy, but the truth is that evolution will select for patriarchal men. Patriarchy is not a synonym for control. It means a man who manages women and other men and also children. So
Well,
there's an aspect of patriarchy that's a bit equitable. So for example, ladies before gentlemen, or rewarding women with children in a divorce case.
yeah, I agree with you. I think it all depends on how you define these terms. And if you're defining patriarchy as some kind of oppressive system that prevents individuals from being able to have any sort of freedom or being able to express themselves in various ways, then a lot of us would look at that and say, well, that's not really a good form of a social arrangement. But I think the evolutionary origins, you might say, of patriarchy go back to this idea that men and women are differently suited because of their physical characteristics for different activities. And so in our evolutionary past, males tended to do the harder labor, like going out and trying to kill a giraffe and bring it back, whereas females tended to stay closer to camp, gather more local resources, take care and nurture the kids. So in that sort of arrangement, there are different responsibilities that the different sexes have. And the protective role, the role of trying to resource the offspring, make sure that the mothers and their offspring are safe, that would have been the role of the males in the group. And the females then would have been charged with gathering local resources and taking care of the offspring and nurturing them and doing activities which would have been less physically arduous. So that's the form of patriarchy, you might say, that would have existed in our evolutionary past. I should also add in this, if we look at existing hunter-gatherers, you do see this strict division of labor, but you also see an attitude of equality, typically, between males and females, in the sense that they both recognize that what they're doing is important for the group. It isn't as if one role is better than the other, or one role is more important than the other. The roles are different, but the roles are complementary and essential for the survival of the group. I think somewhere along the line, a lot of people argue when settled agriculture started to come into play, and you started to have the ability of males to hold resources, like hold great tracts of land, and eventually start to hold money as a resource, that a form of patriarchy that might have been somewhat different and more oppressive might have started to come into play. And that is where you have a male who has so much land and so many resources that he's able to hold a large number of females, harems, as to improve his reproductive success. And to have that many females, a certain degree of control has to be exerted. And so as you move forward in time, you could start to see where a form of patriarchy might evolve that is more negative in how it's looking at individuals compared to the form of patriarchy that you might see going back into the hunter-gatherer days.
I make a distinction between equitable and inequitable patriarchy.
Yeah.
Today we're living in the era of equitable patriarchy. So women are autonomous, they work, but ladies still come before gentlemen.
Yeah, and I think that that form of patriarchy is something that is more in line with the form of patriarchy that you saw early in our evolutionary history, in our hunter-gatherer history, where you have different roles, and the males typically have this more protective role, but the roles are equally valued. Whereas, you know, you don't always see that in some circumstances where a single powerful male's reproductive success can depend on controlling as many females as possible. That, I think, would fall under your inequitable patriarchy definition.
And the truth, again, Ross, is that men don't have a problem deferring to women. So studies show that people are more supportive of policies benefiting women, and they are also less likely to attack women. And I don't have a problem with the conclusions of that type of research. I'm a guy, and the reality is that women say that they're independent. I don't have a problem with female being independent, but I do believe that most men generally like deferring to women for various reasons.
Well, I think that there is deference to either sex, depending upon skills and knowledge. Wouldn't you think?
Yeah, I agree. I do agree.
Yeah,
But in relation to women, men have a soft spot.
yeah, I think there's some truth in that. I don't think any man or most men don't want to be seen as a bully. And too often, if you are not allowing a woman or a female to express herself, or if you are overly controlling, you can be looked upon as being bullying. Why are you, taking this individual who is physically weaker than you and being so disrespectful? Pick somebody your own size, that kind of thinking. And so I think men can be sensitive to that sort of thing. Most men, obviously.
No, most men, Ross, are likely to support women in relation to conflict with men, and most men have no interest in abusing women.
Well, I would hope that would be true. And I think it probably is true in most cases, but there are some cases of abusive males. There are some cases.
And they're repulsive. We find such men repulsive.
Yeah, I agree. But unfortunately, I think one of the things that happens is that laws often get based on the bad behavior of a few. And so those laws are there to protect from a minority of individuals who tend not to be able to behave in an appropriate way. And sometimes that can be problematic.
So for example, this will be my last point on the topic, but some studies show that women compete with each other fiercely. And also on the internet, women are also likely to criticize each other using quite harsh language.
Sure. And that's not something that is unexpected from an evolutionary point of view. We typically think of males as competing for females. And that tends to be the case for most species. When we look out into nature, it's usually males that are competing and females that are doing the choosing. But it is the case that something happened over the course of our evolutionary history, in that males became almost as important as a reproductive resource to females as females were to males, because male investment became very important for females. Our offspring are very, very dependent, and a female by herself, especially if you go into our evolutionary past, she couldn't have made it trying to resource her offspring all by herself. She needed help from others, and a male partner became a very important source of that help in protecting and resourcing a very dependent offspring. So females in our ancestral past, they became just as sensitive to who are the males out there that are reliable, who are good providers of resources. And they started to compete for those males. Just like males were looking at females and thinking, okay, if I'm going to spend all my time with a single female, I want one who has good reproductive potential. And so they started competing for females who had greater reproductive value. And so you see competition going both ways in our species, whereas in most other species, it tends to be just more males competing for females and not as much female on female competition.
Exactly. So, for example, men are more likely to prefer short-term relationships than women, but on average, both parties prefer long-term relationships.
Yeah, definitely. And you can understand that again from an evolutionary perspective, in that males have a less amount of investment that they tend to do in offspring. And so there's a bit of sex conflict there, because a female is always going to try to get as much investment out of a male as possible, because that's good for herself and her offspring. A male is always going to be trying to give as little investment as possible, because if he can invest a little bit in a lot of females and still reproduce successfully with all of them, he may be more successful in terms of getting genes into the next generation as a male who puts all of his investment simply into one female. So there is some conflict that can go on there.
But what about the quality of your children?
Yeah, well, there's this quantity versus quality tension that can happen. You know, some males under some circumstances may be driven or may be inclined, I guess is the best word to use, toward a quantity strategy, where they may perceive in their environment that there just aren't that many females worth investing in. And because there aren't that many females worth investing in, then probably a better strategy is try to just go for big numbers. And that is impregnate as many females as possible and hope that some of those offspring are able to survive and be successful. That's more of a quantity strategy. A quality strategy is more one where there are many females in the environment who they look like good investments. They look like they will be faithful. You can depend on them to have your offspring and not someone else's offspring. And so it's worth giving much more investment in a single female and producing maybe fewer offspring in total, but all of those offspring are high quality. They're all likely to survive. They're all likely to have high reproductive success themselves. So whether you tend to go quality or quantity often depends on how you perceive your environment.
So Ross, are you a quantity or a quality guy? I prefer quality.
Have to talk to my wife about that.
Yeah, I prefer quality. It's better to invest in one woman and have 2 children than to sleep with 20 women and get 50 children who may not be that smart.
Well, right. And often when we look at the comparison between those situations, it's better for both the offspring and it's better for the parents. The parents often tend to have longer life, better health, better adjustment. They tend to often be much more successful financially, and that then flows down to their offspring, who tend to be much better off. You often see the quantity strategy happening in circumstances that are already poor in terms of resources, socioeconomic status, more impoverished resources. And so you tend to see these things fluctuating depending upon just what's the overall nature of the environment that you are in. Are you in an environment that already has a fairly good amount of resources? People are employed, there are already stable families there. If so, quality tends to be the best way to go. In other circumstances, more impoverished circumstances, unstable families, there isn't a whole lot of marriage going on, then quantity may be the best thing you can do.
Fast life history versus a slow life history.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. No, we have been talking about rituals, but for a minute we diverted, and now we're going to return to rituals. Ross, are rituals a better predictor of commitment than words?
Well, right. That's exactly why ritualized behaviors, and then by extension, full-blown rituals started to emerge. Because the best way to try to gauge somebody's true intentions are to have them perform some kind of an act which has a cost to it. So if I can just say to you, hey, you can trust me, don't worry about it. That's a very low cost act. Anybody can say that. If on the other hand, I'm willing to go to pre-marriage classes with you, I'm willing to go through a whole marriage ceremony with you, I'm willing to give you gifts, and I'm engaging in all these sorts of behaviors which are of some cost to me. They're costing me time, they're costing me resources, they're costing me effort of some sort. That is surely a more reliable indicator that I'm really serious about this. So ritualized behaviors, the reason why they are exaggerated, formalized, they follow a script, is because they force the individual then to make a greater commitment to the act. And then when you start to add all kinds of ceremony and ritual to it, and so costs start to go up, then this becomes an even more reliable indicator that this person truly is committed to something. So the easier you make it, the more unreliable the individual tends to be. The more cost you extract from the individual, the more likely they are to be committed. It's just like a down payment. How do you make sure that somebody really wants something? Force them to put 20% down. That shows that you're serious. So you can think of a ritual as 20% down. You're extracting something from them to indicate that they're really serious about their commitment.
It is just like the examples that are enunciated in your paper titled The Essential Role of Ritual in the Transmission and Reinforcement of Social Norms. You said
Right.
that children are more likely to eat food when adults demonstrate that such food is edible by eating it.
Right, exactly. So the one is a much higher cost gesture than the other. It's one thing just to say, here, eat this, it's good. Well, wait a minute, does it taste good? Is it good for me? How am I supposed to know any of these things? How can I truly understand your intentions? Are you trying to help me and be good to me, or are you trying to deceive me? Well, if you force the person to do a higher cost gesture, like eat it yourself first, then you can be much more sure that their intentions are good.
Yes, it is just like donating money. If you want people to invest in charities, you should be philanthropic.
Yeah, sure. Put up or shut up. Instead of just talk the talk, walk the walk, right? That's the logic upon which ritual was based.
Ross, it's like you appearing on the show. When you appear on the show, you can encourage your colleagues to share their ideas with my guests. You did it, so obviously the show is good.
Yes, I certainly hope so.
Yeah, so and even when I'm charting my show and submitting interviews, I do recognize that some strategies are particularly successful. So for example, if I say I interviewed Matthew Rossano, and he's a prominent evolutionary anthropologist, and you are also an anthropologist, then maybe you could be more likely to appear on the show.
Sure. I mean, that would be used as a sign to indicate, gee, this must be a credible show because I know that individual and that individual is a serious, credible individual and they consented to be on the show. So, it's like a vetting process. It's like a recommending process. Yes, I can accept you or I can depend on you because you have a good recommendation.
Yeah, exactly my point. But if the show was crappy, then people wouldn't recommend it. So, for example,
Right.
Ross, you are an academic, and the purpose of this show is to break the typical ritual on YouTube by highlighting intelligent people like yourself. Personally, I think that much of the conversation in the public space and on social media, including YouTube, it is just too shallow. So I was motivated to start a show like this.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I mean, it's too easy to get a YouTube channel or to get on YouTube and do whatever you want. There's really no vetting process. There's no, well, what's the old saying? If you saw it on the internet, it must be true, right?
Yeah, but and
No real, yeah, there's no real cost, you might say, to putting something out on YouTube or out on the internet. So you can't necessarily rely on the source. But if your show has a higher standard and you put more effort into it and you get guests on it that are more serious, then by virtue of the effort and the cost that has gone into it, it will start to distinguish itself as being something separate, something different, something that's not trying to be deceptive, but is trying to be honest.
yeah, like most of us want to make money, but if to make money, I need to get 1 million viewers and reduce the quality of the product, that then I will be happy with a grand or 2 grand. Sorry.
Well, yeah, and another thing to think about is that in the long run, are you going to make more money with a shallow show that individuals tune in and they go, oh, that's kind of funny and entertaining, but they grow weary of it very quickly? Or a show with more depth where somebody tunes in and stays with it. And you start to, over the long run, have more money than someone who just makes a quick buck.
Yeah, yes, Matt, it is the long-term versus the short-term strategy. So presently on YouTube, many of the better channels literally depict babies laughing. And yes, and as an anthropologist, I would love to know, why do people like to watch children laugh?
Oh, I think it just warms our heart. When we see little happy children, then that tells us that there's a successful kid who's being cared for, who's thriving, and therefore that's an indicator of reproductive success, which from an evolutionary standpoint, that's what we're all after anyway.
Yeah, yeah. So like if you want to make money, just resign from your job and do you have grandchildren?
Not yet.
Okay, you don't have grandchildren, but you can borrow the neighbor's kid and just let him smile, and that will turn you into a millionaire. Like people
It probably won't. It probably won't last very long, though.
exactly, that's the point. For example, once on CNN, this guy, he showed this baby singing, and overnight it garnered millions of views. But do I remember his name? No, I do not.
Right, exactly. And so taking it back to ritual, ritual is one of those indicators that I'm in for a long term rather than a short term. My commitment is part of a long-term strategy, not a short-term strategy.
I love that example because both of us were having a fun time making jokes, and you're able to relate these silly points to rituals. And I guess my audience will appreciate that. As I've always said, smart people can identify the brilliance in very mundane points.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think that's true.
But Ross, I must read this statement in your article. Learning a society's normative standards, that is, the attitudes and behaviors leading to social approval, could be risky if based solely or even predominantly on verbal instruction. In our evolutionary past, those who did so would have been at far greater risk of social manipulation compared to those who critically evaluated words relative to actions. Beautiful.
Yeah, right. I mean, that shows you the danger of just relying on information that comes to you verbally from another. People can always lie. People can have ulterior motives. Talk is cheap, as they say. So what ritual does is ritual increases the cost to the individual who is trying to transmit the message. So if by transmitting a message, I have to make a great sacrifice, you're much more likely to see that message as being true and reliable. Probably the most costly message that someone can transmit is being a martyr, right? Being a martyr says, here's the cost that I am willing to endure to transmit a message. And that is, I'm willing to die to transmit this message. Well, that's about as high a cost as you can get. But others who might be watching that would say, wow, I mean, this guy is willing to die for these ideas or for this belief. This belief must really be important. It must really have high value. Otherwise, he wouldn't do that. Maybe I need to look into this belief or this idea if it's that valuable to that individual.
Exactly. But Mark, I'm a bit puzzled. Animals, do animals have rituals?
Well, they have ritualized behaviors. So think again about the mating dance of a goose, or think about the play bow of a dog. I would not call those true rituals because there's no cultural symbols that are surrounding that act. But it is a fairly high cost act. Now, they can vary in their cost, but they are acts which are designed to be more costly than just generic ordinary acts. And they're designed then to send some kind of a message to other members of the species. So those things certainly do exist in other species out there, ritualized behaviors that are designed to extract some degree of cost and therefore transmit a more reliable message to other members of the species.
All right then. And another question. Can animals be moral?
Well, there certainly are standards of behavior, you might say, that exist within different animal social groups. Now, whether you want to use the term morality to describe that depends upon how you define morality. But if you look at, say, a chimpanzee group, that's a social group. And within that social group, there are going to be certain behaviors that will make the individual more popular in the group, more liked by other members of the group, or will make the person or make the individual chimpanzee, make them an outcast in the group. And so there are what you might think of as being norms or standards of how you're supposed to behave in this group if you're going to be accepted by others. Now, if you want to call that morality, then you know, there may be some who would argue with that. They would say that there are other aspects that are important to call it morality, but there are standards of behavior. If you're a social animal, you want to get along well with others in your group, because if you don't, if you end up getting kicked out of your group because nobody can get along with you, or you're so selfish that others start to, you know, not like you so much, then that could be dangerous for your own reproductive success and your survival. So I would say it's out of standards of behavior that are pre-existing in animal groups that what we think of as human morality starts to emerge.
And another point is that animals do not have the capacity for abstract thought. Therefore, if one is to be moral, he must have an understanding of what it means to be a moral agent.
Well, right. And that starts to get you into the debate about whether we can call animal group standards of behavior morality or not. How is the animal himself or herself regarding the standard? And a lot of folks would argue they're only regarding the standard in a very selfish way. And that is, you know, an animal is part of a social group. By behaving in various ways, they start to realize that certain kinds of behavior are rewarded. Certain kinds of behavior are not rewarded within the group. And they simply start to adjust their behavior so they're doing more of the rewarded behaviors and fewer of the non-rewarded behaviors. that really, for some, they would say, well, that's not really morality. Morality is where you have some kind of abstract framework of right and wrong up in your head. And there may be times when that abstract framework tells you, I have to engage in a certain behavior, behavior X, to be moral, to conform to this framework. That may make me very unpopular in my group for various reasons. But still, my framework tells me that's the only way I can truly be moral. So there are those ethicists and philosophers who would point to that as an important distinction. They would say humans can do this when we want to behave morally. We can compare our behavior to a framework, regardless of whether that's going to make us liked or disliked by our social group. Whereas with animals, they're going to tend much more to just be doing whatever it is that's necessary to keep in good standing with their social group.
And I tend to support the earlier view, which we discussed, previously. Human beings are moral agent. To become a moral agent, one must appreciate morality. And in this regard, animals are not like human beings. Therefore, they cannot have morality.
Right. And that's the argument that a number of folks would make, and other philosophers and ethicists, they would make that sort of argument. To have morality, first you have to have this abstract framework, and we don't necessarily see that in most other animals. The position that I would take on that is to say that, well, that's fine. I think what we see in animals is we see this tendency to want to get along well in our social groups. I think we can point to some studies that can tell us that there is at least a very limited sense of abstract thinking in some animals. But over the course of our evolutionary history, these things start to expand for various reasons in our ancestors, where their ability to think abstractly gets beyond those limitations that we have in, say, other apes, gorillas, chimpanzees, and so forth. And it gets married, it gets combined with group norms that have already been present in primate groups, to the point where our ancestors start to become much more self-aware of what they're doing and why are they doing it. And now they start to develop some kind of an abstract framework for how we should behave towards each other in our group. And now you start to have the beginnings of morality.
Wow. Matt, this conversation is important. I like to talk about morality, but unfortunately, we have to stick to the point, and the topic today is ritual. So another time we can discuss morality. So we're on the subject of rituals. However, in your article, you also note that social norms are unique to human beings, and norms are different from conventions. What is the difference?
Well, a convention is simply an agreement that we all make to behave in a certain way in order to coordinate with each other. So you can think of driving on the right side of the road as being a convention. There really isn't any moral value to it. If everybody agreed, you could decide that we're going to drive on the left side of the road. That's what the English do, right? They drive on the left side. Does that make them less moral than we Americans who drive on the right side of the road? Not at all. You can do it either way, just as long as everybody agrees that's what we're going to do, so that we can all coordinate with each other effectively. All right, that's a convention. A convention is simply an agreement that the whole group makes that we're going to do it this way rather than that way, so that we can get along with each other and we can operate with each other effectively. Now, it starts to become a norm when some kind of moral weight gets put on that agreement. When we start to say, no, doing it this way, we all agree, not only is that the way we're going to do it, but that's a better way. That's a way that is somehow more valuable, somehow more moral, somehow better than doing it this other way. So now it's a fuzzy boundary. You know, you can start to think of different things and say, well, is there a moral weight to that? How much moral weight is there? So when we make this distinction between conventions and norms, it's not a hard boundary. You know, there are things which sort of straddle the boundary very often. But the question that we always ask, if it's going to be a norm, is, okay, are people going to start to question my character? Are they going to start to think of me as a bad person if I don't do this action the way our group says I'm supposed to do it? Okay. And if that's the case, now you're dealing with a norm. Okay. A norm, violating a norm affects a person's character or how others view their character. Whereas violating a convention makes things inconvenient for an individual and for others. Doesn't necessarily call their character into question.
Ross, I would like to give a counter example.
Sure.
A convention can become a norm in a slow life history strategy. So, for example, in a normal society where people are intelligent, if you bump into someone, it is polite to say sorry. That is a convention. But in a more violent society, not saying sorry could cost you your life.
Well, yeah, I guess I would disagree with that a little bit. I think
I have really good examples, but you may disagree.
well, but the example that you give there, if you bump into somebody, I think it's a norm that you should apologize to.
Yeah, it's good to apologize.
Yeah,
Well, you think it's a norm? I see just more at a convention because the cost of not apologizing are not really that great.
they aren't. It depends on the circumstances. It depends on where you're at. If you're in the bar and people are drinking and there's a lot of bikers in the bar and folks that are kind of bad dudes, then I think bumping
It's
into
definitely a norm. In that sense, it is definitely a norm to say sorry.
yeah, and that's in that circumstance, if I bump into one of the biker guys, I'm going to say I'm sorry, because if I don't, I think I'm going to suffer a cost.
Yeah. So
Whereas,
Ross,
yeah,
well, this is really a silly question. It is besides the point, but can you fight?
can I fight?
Yes.
I guess if I have to, I would prefer not to.
Oh, so you can fight. Well, I don't fight. And people often say that because of my weight, others may be afraid to assault me because I'm not very big. I'm quite skinny. But if I were a masculine guy, then I would get into fights all the time because my personality can be a bit abrasive.
Well, I guess you have to be careful with that.
Yeah, so my weight insulates me from being attacked. People say it all the time.
Yeah, well, I think doing that sort of thing, again, that has a cost to it, right? If you're going to go around and get in fights with all kinds of people, even if you are big and tough, it's going to take its toll after a while. And it would be nice just to be able to sit down and have a quiet dinner and not have somebody who you got into a ruckus with a week ago come up to you and want to challenge you again. So there's a cost to that sort of thing. And personally, I would prefer not to pay it. I would just, let's just leave it.
Yeah. Little boys like to fight. So, for example, when I was a little boy, I was enthralled by the idea of people fighting and of women fighting. But as an older person, fighting seems like a waste of time.
Well, right, but it might not necessarily be a waste of time when you're a younger male. It goes back to that idea of competition. And one of the ways that males often distinguish themselves from each other, and they formed a hierarchy that females then could use to decide who they wanted to mate with, was through some kind of challenge, physical violence, displays of strength and genetic quality and all that sort of stuff. And so that's why you tend to see it in younger males. They're trying to display their quality to the local females.
What were you like as a younger male?
Oh, I was a nice guy. I had a great sense of humor, and I hung out with a bunch of great guys. We always had a good time, and no, I was a normal kid. Can't say there was anything distinguishing about me. I tried to get decent grades in school. I tried to get along with folks, and had a lot of fun with my friends. So I would say it was a normal, happy upbringing with a lot of good friends and a good family, and nothing distinguishing about it at all, I wouldn't say.
I like your life, Ross. You are yes, you are quite jovial, and as a young man, you worked really hard, and as such, today you are being rewarded with an interview.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, I would like to think that whatever success I have had is come out of hard work, and and it's good. It's also nice to be able to have some ideas and share those ideas with others, and hopefully some people can benefit from them.
Yes, and my interview process is very selective. I don't choose idiots.
I hope not.
Yeah, so like before I select an academic, I literally read his articles, like many of them. I don't like stupid people.
Well, very good. I do have a new book out.
Yeah, I know, and we're going to promote your book.
Very good. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm a businessman, Ross. I don't have a problem with the vulgar promotion of the works of my guests.
I'm glad to hear that.
That's the least I can do. They could have said no, but they said yes. And they have been saying yes quite a lot if you have been looking at the channel.
Oh, yeah. I saw you did have a number of other interviews on there. Yes.
Yeah. Some people are saying to me, how did you get these people? And I say, can they say anything other than yes? Humility is overrated, and we won't talk about that now, but the evidence is growing. Humility is a bit overrated. I'm not a braggart or anything, but humility is a bit overrated.
Very good.
Yeah, but now we're going to talk about rituals and how rituals can contribute to military success. So I'm looking at one of your books. It is titled Supernatural Selection: How Religion Evolved. And on page 50, you are talking about the Nuer and the Dinka. And you say that the one group was successful because of its rituals. Let me read what you wrote. Dinka alliances were more fragile and less kin-based. In all their years of conflict, there was not a single instance of a Dinka defeat of a Nuer army.
Right. Yeah. I think I was using that there to support the idea that there was probably a level of group competition that went on in our evolutionary past that selected for more well-organized groups that had ritual activities that binded them together more strongly. They would have had an advantage over groups that didn't have that kind of ritual activity.
And this has this has implications for modern day America. So contrary to the school of decline, relative to China, America is doing well. China, in comparison to America, is still a laggard in terms of technology. However, American culture is on the decline in the sense that more people are critical of American culture, rituals are declining, activists are debasing the flag. Therefore, if America and China were to fight a war, maybe America would lose.
Well, I think the United States probably has a big technological advantage, I would hope.
It does.
Military strength. But yeah, you're right. Well, here's something to think about. I think that at our most basic level, from our evolutionary past, we are naturally a tribal species, not necessarily a national species. So in other words, we cling naturally to kin, extended kin, and then some kind of tribal identity. That's what we're most comfortable with. What you have to do with a nation somehow is you have to somehow get various tribes to connect together into a larger grouping, a nationalized grouping. And you do that with symbols and stories and rituals. And that's what we've done in America, right? We have a symbol, our flag, we have a story of our past, our past and how we fought for freedom. And then you have rituals surrounding that. You stand up and you salute the flag and you sing the national anthem. And all of these things are the stories, the symbols, the rituals that combine tribes together and make them into something larger, a national grouping of some kind. I think one of the things that we've been seeing over the past, 40, 50 years or so, and really accelerating maybe in the last 20 years, is a return to tribalism, where people are now questioning, denying the importance of those stories, those symbols, those rituals. And we're starting to see an increasing fragmentation of the United States back into those smaller tribal units. And whether you can then put the souffle back together and you can, start to create a stronger national identity out of those tribes, that's a question that remains to be seen. But we would, and from an evolutionary standpoint, we would anticipate that this would happen, because our natural tendency is tribal, not necessarily national, and you have to do a lot of work to hold a nation together, and where we seem to be less and less willing to put in that work and that effort.
Well, Ross, I am pro-America and pro-Western civilization, but presently I am sitting down, drinking juice, and watching the sorry decline of America.
Yeah, as many of us are. And it's rather disheartening and troubling.
It is quite troubling. Your country is, look, on an economic level, America is still a powerhouse, but socially and culturally, it is a mess.
Yeah, I agree with you. And again, the only thing I can offer as an academic is that notion of tribalism, and we would naturally expect out of any country. America, they always talk about American exceptionalism. Well, you're not going to make yourself an exception to your evolutionary history. You just can't do it.
No,
but nature will always rear itself, and it's doing so in the United States right now.
But Ross, you are a white man, and white males are not cherished in America today. So I doubt that people care about your view on the basis that you're white. I do care because I'm a sensible person. I don't judge people on the basis of race, but
hey,
America is. Yes.
Can I interrupt you a second? I just got a notice from my computer. My battery's running out. Can you let me run and get my power cord and plug it in? Just take me.
Okay. All right.
Hold on just a second.
Yeah. All right. So you guys can go and check out his book, Supernatural Selection or Religion Evolved. He is also a contributor to Psychology Today. So that's what you can do in the spare time. All right. Yeah.
All right.
All right. So are you back now?
Yes.
All right, great. As we were saying earlier, Ross, as a white man, to some people, your opinion may not be valuable.
Well, I think ideas should be judged based on the value of the idea.
I agree with you.
So unless we start to get back to that notion, we are seriously in trouble, because you don't evaluate the person, you evaluate the idea.
Yeah, but we're already in this space where the person and his race is more important than the idea.
Yeah, tribal, that tribal mentality. And that's a mentality that we've been falling more and more into. And that's one of the great dangers of it, is that we no longer listen to ideas. We consider first the tribe of the individual that is presenting the idea. And that's not a good thing for any kind of cohesion for a culture.
Yes. So remember, Ross, I promised you that we are going to talk about your book. So go ahead and promote your second book.
Well, actually, this is my fifth book, the latest one that I've just come out with. But yeah, this one looks at the function of rituals.
What is the name of the book?
It is Ritual in Human Evolution and Religion is the name of the book, and it's published by Routledge out of London. And what I'm really trying to do there is I'm trying to look at what I think the purpose of ritual is, the function of it, which I argue is it cultivates and it builds and it directs what I call psychological resources. So we can think of humans as having lots of psychological resources like loyalty, empathy, concern for others. These are psychological resources that we can then use to help build community. But those resources need to be cultivated in individuals. They don't just naturally start to flow out of individuals, and they have to be directed somehow. I have to decide what it is I'm going to be loyal to, who it is I'm going to empathize with. And ritual activity is the mechanism that does all that. Ritual activity builds loyalty in us toward something, toward a group, toward a nation. Ritual activity causes us to empathize with others that are members of our group. And so ritual then is this mechanism for cultivating and building these psychological resources so that communities remain viable and strong.
All right. I like the summary, but unfortunately, we have to wrap up. It was a pleasure to speak to you, Ross.
All right. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
All right. Bye.